The document they found wasn't classified. That was the first thing that unsettled Praetor Executor Ven Sarath of the Dominion's Seventh Reach. Not the document's contents, not the language it was written in, not even the symbol printed at the top, which his translation matrix eventually rendered as something between a government seal and a joke. What unsettled him was that it had been left in the open. Sitting on a folding table outside what his scouts reported was a human military installation, weighted down by a ceramic cup containing a cold, dark liquid, as though someone had stepped away mid-read and simply forgotten to take it with them. His second-in-command, Fleetclaw Orisa, picked it up with a manipulation tendril and held it toward the light. "What does it say?" Ven asked. Orisa was quiet for a long moment, her translation matrix clicking through the idiom filters. Then she read it aloud, carefully, the way you read something you suspect you've mistranslated. "It says, if you're reading this, you took the bait. Good luck with that." The ultimatum had been delivered 14 standard cycles before that moment, in the clean, formal language of Dominion diplomatic protocol, which the Dominion considered a courtesy, and which most civilizations in the known galaxy understood to mean that the decision had already been made. The seventh reach of the Dominion Eternal had expanded to humanity's stellar neighborhood after 3 centuries of unbroken territorial absorption, and the message broadcast on all frequencies to every human-inhabited system was, by Dominion standards, generous. Surrender administrative control of your colonies within 30 cycles. Retain cultural autonomy. Avoid unpleasantness. It was a standard offer. The Dominion had made it 411 times across 4 centuries. 411 civilizations had accepted, in varying degrees of haste, with varying degrees of grief. None had refused. The mathematics were not subtle. The Dominion's military infrastructure exceeded humanity's by a factor of several hundred, and that was before accounting for the strategic reality that the Seventh Reach alone represented more concentrated firepower than the entire human fleet combined. The response humanity sent back arrived in 6 minutes, not 6 cycles, 6 minutes. Ven had read it twice before he understood it wasn't a translation error. The human representative, a title that translated loosely as Secretary General, though the matrix kept flagging the word secretary as anomalous given the context, had replied with a single document, officially formatted, bearing the seal of something called the United Earth Assembly. Ven's analysts spent an hour parsing it for hidden meaning, embedded code, or subtle strategic threat. What they found was nothing. The document was a formal declaration, written in the precise, bureaucratic register of a civilization that understood diplomacy. It acknowledged receipt of the Dominion's ultimatum. It acknowledged the disparity in military capability. It acknowledged, with what the Matrix kept rendering as a grammatical form associated with dry humor, that humanity had conducted a full strategic assessment and understood its situation completely. Then it said in the next line, "We respectfully decline." And beneath that, in smaller text, a phrase the Matrix could not fully render, but which produced in every analyst who reviewed it a sensation of profound unease, because the closest translation it could generate was something between, "We've been waiting for this," and "You have no idea what you just started." Ven had stared at that phrase for a long time. "They're bluffing," Orisa said, though her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who was hopping to be agreed with. Ven looked at the document again, at the 6-minute response time, at the phrase the Matrix couldn't quite translate. "Find out what their fleet is doing," he said. "Right now, all of it." What the fleet was doing was nothing alarming. That was the second mystery. Human warships, and the Dominion's long-range sensors had cataloged 312 of them, a number that would have been impressive for a species with 2 centuries more development time, were holding position at their standard patrol routes. No emergency repositioning, no crisis formations, No powering of weapons beyond routine maintenance cycles. A handful of vessels near the outer colonies had actually reduced their patrol radius, as though standing down. The analysts spent 4 hours building explanations for this, each one more elaborate than the last, and then listened to all of them and dismissed all of them for the same reason. They all required humans to be behaving rationally, and the 6-minute response time, and the phrase the Matrix couldn't fully translate, and the document left on the table outside the military installation. The one that had been left there deliberately, which his scouts had confirmed by identifying 3 separate observation posts watching to see whether the Dominion would take it. None of those things fit into any rational model. "They're not scared," said Orisa, and she said it the way you say something that explains everything and nothing simultaneously. Ven understood. In 4 centuries of expansion, the Dominion had issued 411 ultimatums. Fear was the normal response, not the screaming, paralytic fear of a species that didn't understand what it was facing, that was rare and sad, and resolved quickly. The normal fear was the quiet, dignified, calculating fear of a civilization that ran the numbers, understood the odds, and found a way to preserve something meaningful within the framework of Dominion administration. Every civilization the Dominion had ever encountered was afraid, because fear was the appropriate response to a vastly superior force. Humans had read the document, they had the numbers, and they had responded in 6 minutes with a formal declaration of refusal and a phrase that might mean you have no idea what you just started. And then their fleet had done nothing alarming. "Pull every intercept we have," Ven said. "Internal communications, civilian broadcasts, military channels, everything. I want to know what they're saying to each other." The intercepts arrived over the following hours, and Ven's analysts began the translation process with the methodical professionalism that characterized Dominion intelligence operations. And then, approximately 40 minutes into the work, something unprecedented happened. An analyst stopped her work and simply stared at her output screen. Then she called over her supervisor. Then her supervisor called Ven. "Sir," the supervisor said, "I need you to look at this. I need you to tell me whether the Matrix is malfunctioning." The intercepts, civilian broadcasts, military channels, internal government communications, all of it, were not showing panic. They were not showing emergency mobilization. They were not showing grief or fear or the quiet, dignified calculation of a civilization making the best of a terrible situation. They were showing laughter. Ven's first interpretation of this was denial. He was familiar with the psychological literature. Species under existential pressure sometimes produced euphoric, apparently inappropriate behavioral responses as a coping mechanism. The laughter wasn't real laughter, not in the functional sense. It was stress displacement, emotional noise produced by nervous systems overwhelmed by fear, and expressing it in the only way the pressure valve allowed. He held this interpretation for approximately 6 hours, which was how long it took for his analysts to translate enough of the actual content of what humans were saying to each other to understand that the laughter had asterisk subjects. They were laughing asterisk at asterisk the Dominion. Not hysterically, not in the dark, hollow way of people who have run out of options. They were laughing the way people laugh at something they find genuinely, specifically funny, and what they found funny based on the intercepted content was the Dominion's ultimatum itself, its phrasing, its assumptions. Several humans in positions of apparent authority had publicly referred to the 30-cycle compliance window as adorable. A military broadcast, not encrypted, Ven noted, asterisk not encrypted, had described the Dominion's force projection estimates as the most flattering thing anyone's ever said about us. One intercept, from a source his analysts flagged as a senior military commander based on communication patterns, said simply, "Tell them we need at least 40 cycles. We're still setting up." Setting up what? The intercept did not specify. and nobody around this commander had asked. "They're performing," Orisa said. "It's theater. They want us to think they're confident." Ven looked at the intercept again, at the phrase asterisk we're still setting up, at the fact that it was unencrypted, at the fact that the observation posts near the document on the table had been watching to confirm the Dominion found it. "They know we're listening," he said. "Yes. So either they're performing for us and this is psychological theater," he paused, "or they're not performing and they actually think this is funny and we don't understand why." Neither explanation was comfortable. The second was worse. "Begin the advance," he said. "Standard protocol. We'll have a real answer in 10 cycles." The advance began, and for the first 4 cycles it proceeded exactly as Dominion Standard Protocol described. Frontier picket vessels withdrew before the 7th reaches forward elements, which was expected. Supply infrastructure pulled back from contested zones, which was expected. Human civilian populations on the outer colonies received formal notification of incoming Dominion administrative transition, and the response to those notifications was not what was expected. It wasn't resistance, exactly. Resistance was expected and planned for, and the Dominion had 17 distinct response frameworks for resistance at varying intensity levels, ranging from passive non-cooperation through armed insurgency. What Ven's forward commanders reported wasn't on any of those frameworks. What they reported was, the civilians seemed to find the notifications interesting. "Interesting," Ven repeated. "That's the word the translation matrix keeps producing," his forward commander said through the communication channel. His name was Subpraetor Heth, and he was not easily unsettled. He sounded unsettled. "They're reading them carefully, taking notes. Some of them are making copies. One settlement organized what appears to be a community meeting to discuss the document structure." A human approached my lead contact officer and asked, with what the Matrix is rendering as genuine curiosity, whether the Dominion had any complaints about the phrasing, because they'd apparently translated it from our standard protocol template and weren't sure they'd gotten the tone right. Ven was quiet for a moment. "They translated our asterisk template." "Yes, sir," she said, "and I want to be precise here because the Matrix flagged this," she said. "We wanted to make sure we understood exactly what we were refusing. It didn't seem polite to refuse something without fully reading it first." The community meeting, Heth added, had apparently included refreshments. This was the first thing that had made Orisa laugh, and she covered it quickly, but not quickly enough, and Ven looked at her and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 centuries of operations. He wasn't sure what was happening. The Dominion's intelligence apparatus was, by any measurable standard, excellent. It had processed the internal communications of 411 civilizations through the absorption process and developed sophisticated models for predicting behavior at each stage of compliance. The models had error margins below 3%. They were built on the fundamental assumption, verified across 4 centuries of data, that civilizations under existential military pressure behaved in predictable ways driven by self-preservation logic. The human data kept breaking the models. Not catastrophically, not in ways that suggested imminent military surprise. Humanity's fleet was still doing nothing alarming, which Ven had stopped finding reassuring and started finding actively disturbing, because by cycle 6, they should have been doing asterisk something. Some repositioning, some defensive preparation. The silence of the fleet was starting to feel less like confidence and more like the quiet of a trap waiting to close. But the civilian data was the puzzle that kept him awake through the night cycles. Intercepts from across the human colonies showed a population that was, by every behavioral metric, engaged. People discussing strategy. People comparing historical analogs, and the historical analogs they kept referencing were, the translation matrix noted with some difficulty, almost uniformly situations where a smaller, outgunned force had won against overwhelming odds. Not situations where outgunned forces had negotiated favorable surrender terms. Situations where they had *1. And always, threaded through the strategic discussion, the laughter. A human word kept appearing in the intercepts that the Matrix couldn't fully render. The closest translation it could produce was something like *underdog*, and it carried. And this was what made his analysts uncomfortable enough to flag it, a connotation of positive anticipation. As though being the smaller, weaker party in a conflict was not a source of dread, but a source of something almost like excitement. As though humans had done this before. As though they knew how it went. Pull everything we have on human history, Venn ordered. Not the summary profiles, everything. Their wars, their conflicts, against each other, against their own environment, against anything. I want to understand how many times they have been the underdog. The answer came back in 2 cycles, and it was the first thing in this entire operation that made Venn feel genuinely cold. The answer was, nearly always. Humanity's entire recorded history was a catalog of situations where they should have lost, and didn't. Not because they were stronger, or better armed, or more technologically sophisticated. Their history was full of catastrophic defeats, crippling losses, civilizational near collapses. They had lost, repeatedly and badly, to disease, to each other, to environmental collapse, to internal fracture so severe it had come within years of ending them as a unified species multiple times. And they had kept going. The phrase in the original declaration, the one the Matrix had kept rendering as somewhere between, "We've been waiting for this," and "You have no idea what you just started." His best linguist came to him on Cycle 7 with a revised translation. "I've been wrong about the grammatical register," she said. Her name was Analyst Sane, and she had been working on human language for 3 years, and she looked like someone who had found something in the dark. "It's not anticipation. It's not threat. It's," she paused. "There's a human concept. They have a word for when someone has survived something so many times that the next instance of it stops producing fear and starts producing something else. Something almost like recognition. Like meeting an old opponent." "What does it produce?" Venn asked. She looked at him steadily. "Readiness." The revised translation of the phrase read, "We know this feeling. We know exactly how this goes." On Cycle 8, the first human military action occurred. Venn had expected it to be a fleet engagement. The Dominion's forward elements were well inside human-claimed space by Cycle 8, and if humanity had any intention of contesting the advance militarily, this was the window. He had 3 complete battle groups ready. He had contingencies for every form of engagement the human fleet could credibly mount. What happened instead was that 47 small vessels, not warships, the sensors confirmed, something closer to fast couriers or light transports, emerged from the debris field surrounding a large gas giant in the outer system and scattered in 47 different directions simultaneously, accelerating to their maximum rated speed and jumping away before any of his vessels could achieve intercept. 47 vessels, no weapon signatures, no military markings. "What were they carrying?" Orisa asked. "We don't know," said the sensor officer. "We're tracking their jump vectors. They went in 47 different directions." Venn thought about the document on the table. "We're still setting up." He thought about 47 vectors radiating outward into the galaxy in 47 directions. "They weren't fleeing," he said, "and it wasn't a question." "No," the sensor officer agreed quietly. "Whatever they were doing, they were very deliberate about the spread pattern. Those vectors cover," she paused, running the calculation. "They cover approximately 60% of inhabited Dominion space within 6 jumps." The room was quiet. "What," said Orisa, "were they delivering?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew, and Venn recognized with a sensation. He hadn't experienced in decades that this was precisely what humanity had intended. The 47 ships were a question. A visible, traceable, deliberately uninterpretable question sent in 47 directions into the heart of Dominion territory, and they had made sure the Dominion sensors would catch the launch. They wanted him to wonder. He did wonder. He wondered through Cycle 9 and Cycle 10 as his advance continued, and as the Dominion administrative teams began arriving at the outer colonies, and as the human civilians there continued to be, in Sub-Praetor Heth's increasingly bewildered dispatches, asterisk cooperative in ways that didn't make sense. Not passive, not broken, cooperative, cheerful even, asking detailed questions about Dominion administrative procedures, taking notes, keeping copies, learning the system with an attention to detail that Heth described in one dispatch as the most thorough I've ever seen from an absorbed population in 40 years of operations. They're preparing something, Heth said in the dispatch on Cycle 11. I don't know what, but they're learning everything they can about how we operate, and they're not hiding that they're learning, and I don't know whether to be reassured by their cooperation or frightened by it. Ven had sent back a single line, be frightened. It was Cycle 12, when the first Dominion vessel disappeared. Not destroyed, not engaged, disappeared. A patrol cruiser, the Asterisk 7th Vigilance Asterisk, had been running standard picket duty in the Karath corridor when its transponder went silent. No distress signal. No weapons fire detected by nearby vessels. No debris. It simply stopped broadcasting and was gone, and when the nearest response vessel arrived at its last known position, they found nothing except, and this was the detail that lodged in Ven's mind like a splinter, a single human communication buoy, civilian grade, broadcasting on an open frequency. The message on the buoy was brief. This one took 11 minutes, we're getting faster. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, EFS asterisk persistent. Orissa read the translation twice. Then she said, very carefully, what took 11 minutes? I don't know, Ven said. And then, because it was true and because someone needed to say it, that's what they want us to ask. Persistent, the name of the vessel. He fed it through the matrix because human ship names were not random. Sane had explained that human civilizations named their vessels with deliberate intention, that the name was a statement of identity and purpose. The Matrix rendered it as, continuing without stopping despite difficulty or opposition. The second vessel disappeared on Cycle 14. The buoy said 7 minutes. This is where Ven made his first catastrophic misinterpretation. Based on the disappearances, based on the 11 and 7-minute timeline, based on the ship name and the message and the 47 scattered vectors from Cycle 8, his intelligence team built a model. They were proud of the model. It incorporated every data point coherently and produced a single, elegant explanation. Humanity had a cloaking technology they hadn't revealed. The 47 ships had delivered cloaking components or technical specialists to coordinates throughout Dominion space. The Persistent and whatever vessels were working with it were testing an ambush strike capability, improving their speed through practice runs, building toward a coordinated assault on Dominion infrastructure from within their own territory. It was a good model. It was internally consistent. It explained every data point. It was completely wrong, and Ven wouldn't know that for 11 more cycles. What was actually happening, and the full scope of it only emerged later, in fragmented pieces, each piece worse than the last, had nothing to do with cloaking technology. The Persistent was a vessel crewed by 41 humans, none of them distinguished by any exceptional physical or technological capability. What they had been doing, in the 11 minutes and then the 7 minutes it took to neutralize the Asterisk 7th Vigilance and the second cruiser, was something so operationally unexpected that, when Ven finally received the technical account of it, he read it 4 times and still felt like he was missing something. They had boarded the vessels. Not with superior numbers, 41 humans against a standard Dominion crew of 220. Not with overwhelming force, with speed and planning, and a willingness to absorb casualties that his tactical analysts described, in the dry language of professional military assessment, as outside modeled human self-preservation parameters. The Persistence crew had lost 9 people taking the first cruiser. 9 out of 41, more than 20% casualties before the action was complete. By any rational military calculus, a unit sustaining those losses in the opening phase of an engagement should withdraw and regroup. They had sent back a buoy, nodding their time and announcing they were getting faster. Then they had done it again. The second action cost them 4, because they had learned from the first. 11 minutes, 7 minutes, learning, adapting, paying in blood for the knowledge of how to do it better and treating that knowledge as a resource worth the price, and then immediately spending it again. How many crew members does the Persistent have left? Orisa asked, when the full account came through. 28, said the intelligence officer. And where is it now? A pause. We don't know. Ven sat with that for a long moment. 28 humans, on a vessel that had taken 2 of his cruisers with 41, had disappeared into his operational territory, and he didn't know where they were. And somewhere in Dominion space, 47 packages delivered by 47 ships were doing something he hadn't identified yet. And the human fleet was still doing nothing alarming. Find them, he said, and then, because it needed to be said clearly, all of them. Find out what the 47 ships delivered. Find the Persistent. Find whatever else we haven't found yet. Because we are operating with incomplete information and I will not continue to do that. His intelligence chief looked at him carefully and said, Sir, I think that may be the point. The packages arrived at their destinations on Cycle 16, and Ven learned about this not through his own intelligence network, but through the Dominion High Council itself, which was the moment he understood that the scale of what humanity was doing was not a localized military problem. High Council's emergency session, the first emergency session in 40 years, was called because something had appeared in the administrative centers of 63 Dominion worlds simultaneously. Not a weapon, not a military force, a document physically printed in the precise bureaucratic register of Dominion administrative law, formatted exactly according to Dominion governmental standards, translated without error into the local administrative language of each world it appeared on. The document was a formal complaint. A legal filing, actually, submitted by the United Earth Assembly to the Dominion High Council under Dominion Compact Article 7, Subsection 4, which governed the rights of territories in administrative transition. This article existed because 3 centuries ago a smaller member of the Dominion had successfully argued for it, and it had been included in the compact because the Dominion's legal architects had calculated it would never be materially relevant to a military absorption process. The filing argued, in meticulous, error-free Dominion legal language, using Dominion legal precedents the humans had apparently spent the last decade identifying and cataloging, that the military ultimatum issued to Earth violated 6 specific procedural requirements under Dominion Compact law, and that therefore humanity's administrative autonomy was legally protected under Article 7 until a compliant process was followed, which would take. And here humanity had done their arithmetic carefully, approximately 840 cycles to complete under standard Dominion administrative procedure. 840 cycles. 840 cycles of mandatory procedural compliance, during which the Dominion was legally prohibited under its own laws from finalizing administrative transition. The filing had been submitted to 63 different Dominion administrative courts simultaneously, so that no single court could simply decline jurisdiction. The 47 ships hadn't been delivering weapons components. They had been delivering lawyers and law students and legal researchers who had spent a decade studying Dominion Compact law for exactly this purpose. And the humans on the outer colonies, who had been so cooperative, so attentive, taking such careful notes about Dominion administrative procedure. They had been building the evidentiary record for the filing while the Dominion's own administrative teams were in their settlements. The buoy from the asterisk persistent replayed in Ven's mind. This one took 11 minutes. We're getting faster. They had been running the legal operation and the military operation simultaneously, with the military operation structured specifically to create documented violations that the legal filing could cite as additional evidence. The laughter. He understood the laughter now, and understanding it was worse than not understanding it, because they hadn't been laughing out of bravado or denial or psychological displacement. They had been laughing because they had read the Dominion's ultimatum and seen, immediately, in 6 minutes, both the military situation and the legal one, and they had found it genuinely funny that the Dominion had not. They knew about Article 7 before we sent the ultimatum, Orissa said. She wasn't asking. Yes, Ven said. They prepared for years. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how long have they known we were coming? Ven looked at the legal filing, at the precision of it, at the decade of work embedded in every footnote, at the 47 simultaneous submissions that made jurisdictional evasion impossible. Long enough, he said. The persistent was found on cycle 19, which is to say it was found because it wanted to be found. It emerged from a debris field at the edge of the Karath corridor and broadcast on an open channel in Dominion standard language that it wished to speak with the commanding officer of the 7th Reach, not with an administrative representative, not through a diplomatic channel, with Ven personally by name. He took the call. The face that appeared on his screen was human, which he'd expected. Female, middle-aged by the physiological markers he'd learned to read, with the particular quality of stillness in the eyes that his experience now associated with humans who had been in situations where stillness was necessary for survival. There was a healed scar along her jaw that was still recent enough to have visible coloration. Praetor Executor Sorath, she said, I'm Commander Elena Vasquez. I wanted to introduce myself directly. You have my attention, Ven said. I know. You want to know where my crew is and what we're planning and what the 47 couriers delivered, and you've probably figured out part of it by now. She paused. I want you to know something else. What? We have crew members who are injured, 3 critical. We need medical facilities. She said it evenly, without any inflection of weakness. It was a statement of fact. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something about how humans operate in situations like this. Which is, we tell the truth about what we need, she said, not because we're naive, because we've found it tends to clarify things. She looked at him steadily through the transmission. We need medical facilities. We also need you to understand that my crew boarded 2 of your vessels at a cost of 13 lives, and they knew the cost before they started, and they went anyway, and they will go again. Both of those things are true at the same time. Ven looked at her for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? Because in my experience, she said, the moment that changes everything in a conflict like this is when the larger party stops thinking the smaller party is confused about its situation. Her voice was quiet. We're not confused. We know exactly what you are. We know exactly what we are. We've run every number you've run, and we came to different conclusions, and I want you to understand that the difference isn't optimism. What is the difference? She looked at him, and in the particular quality of her stillness, he saw something he recognized from the historical records his analysts had pulled, from 4 centuries of data about species under existential pressure, an expression he had never seen before in the initial stages of absorption proceedings. Only sometimes, rarely, in the very final stages when a civilization had nothing left to lose. She looked like someone who had decided. "We've done this before," she said. "Different opponents, different stakes. We lose people every time, we always lose people. We keep going anyway, and eventually the other side realizes we are going to keep going past any point they thought possible, and then the calculation changes." She paused. "I'm telling you this now to save time, because the calculation is going to change. The only variable is how long it takes and how much it costs everyone." The channel was quiet. "Your crew members," Ven said finally, "the ones who are critical." "Yes." "Transmit their medical data. I'll have a Dominion medical team standing by." She was quiet for just a moment, and in that moment he saw something shift in her expression, not surprise, exactly, but a recalibration, the look of someone updating a prediction. "Thank you," she said, and then carefully, "That's going to make this harder, for you." "I know," he said. He did know. He knew it the way you know something when you've been running a model for 3 weeks and finally understand which assumption was wrong. He had assumed this was an adversarial proceeding. It was not. It was something more complicated, something for which he wasn't certain the Dominion had a framework, because it required simultaneously holding the reality that humanity was fighting him, and the reality that humanity was not, at any point, treating this as a conflict that had to end in annihilation. They weren't trying to defeat the Dominion. They were trying to change the Dominion's calculation. And they were willing to pay for that, in blood and in years of legal preparation, and in 13 lives on a light transport operating in contested space, because they had looked at the Dominion and decided it was worth changing rather than simply surviving. The High Council's emergency session lasted 9 cycles. Ven submitted his report on cycle 23. His report contained, for the first time in the Dominion's administrative history, a formal recommendation to pause absorption proceedings pending outcome of the compact legal challenge, and it contained something else, a second document, attached as a supplementary analysis, that he had written himself in the ship's night cycle when the corridor was quiet. The supplementary analysis was about humanity's history. Not their military capacity, not their legal strategy, their history, the pattern in it, the specific recurring pattern of a species that had encountered every form of catastrophic loss imaginable and had not developed a mechanism for accepting it as final. Other species, under equivalent pressure, had developed philosophical frameworks that allowed them to recognize and accept defeat in order to preserve something. These frameworks were rational. They were kind in their way. They prevented the additional suffering that came from fighting past the point where fighting could change the outcome. Humanity had not developed this framework. Or rather, and this was the sentence that had taken him longest to write, they had developed it, and then they had examined it, and then they had made the specific choice not to use it, because they had looked at every historical case where they had used it and found that they consistently regretted it, and every historical case where they had refused to use it, and found that the outcome had more often than not, against every rational prediction, been different from what the odds suggested. They weren't irrational. They were operating from a dataset that the Dominion did not have access to, because the Dominion had never fought humanity before. Humanity had fought humanity, for all of recorded history, and they had learned something from it that no other species in the Dominion's 4 centuries of expansion had learned, that the rational calculation was sometimes wrong, that odds were not destiny, that there was a variable that didn't appear in force projection models, and that variable was the specific psychological state of a species that had survived its own worst impulses and come out the other side with something between scar tissue and faith. The supplementary analysis ended with a question, not a conclusion. The question was, how do you absorb a civilization that has decided to treat absorption itself as a solvable problem? The High Council took 40 cycles to respond. In those 40 cycles, the persistent received medical support and resupplied and disappeared again, and 3 more Dominion picket vessels were boarded and neutralized, the times dropping each time: 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2.5. And simultaneously, the legal proceedings in 63 courts began producing preliminary findings that were, in the assessment of the Dominion's own legal staff, not obviously losable. And simultaneously, the human civilian population on the outer colonies continued to be precisely as cooperative as they'd been on Cycle 1, attending every administrative meeting, submitting every required form, taking every required note, and learning the Dominion system with a thoroughness that Heth had stopped describing as ominous and started describing as something I cannot look at directly without feeling like I'm missing something. The humans on those colonies had started referring to the administrative transition period as the study period. The High Council's response when it came was not what Ven expected. It was not a counter-proposal. It was not an escalation order. It was a request formally issued. For the first time in 400 years, the Dominion had used the word request in an administrative communication for a meeting. A direct meeting, not mediated through administrative channels between High Council representatives and the United Earth Assembly. The humans responded in 6 minutes. The response was yes, with 3 requests of their own: that Commander Vasquez attend as a military observer, that the meeting be held on neutral ground rather than Dominion space, and that medical care for the *persistence* remaining injured crew members be continued during the interim period. The third condition was the one that stayed with Ven. He thought about it for a long time, and eventually he called Sane, his linguist, and asked her what she made of it. They could have left it out, she said. The third condition, it was already agreed. They didn't need to make it formal. Why did they? She was quiet for a moment. I think, she said slowly, they wanted it on the record that they asked, that you agreed. I think they're building something. A legal record, Ven said. Maybe or maybe something else, she paused. They treat reciprocity like a foundation rather than a tactic. Every time you do something that acknowledges their humanity, they acknowledge it in return, and every acknowledgement becomes part of the framework. She looked at him. I think they're trying to create a relationship in the middle of a conflict, simultaneously. He thought about Vasquez on the screen. That's going to make this harder for you. She had been right. It was harder. It was significantly harder to prosecute a clean absorption proceeding against an opponent who sent you their wounded soldiers' medical data and said thank you, and then went back to boarding your cruisers with 28 people. It was harder because it was supposed to be harder. That was the entire design. The meeting happened. Ven won't detail it in full here. The record exists, and what matters is what wasn't in the record. What wasn't in the record was the moment in the 14th hour of the session when the senior council representative, Archon Vel, asked the Secretary General of the United Earth Assembly a direct question. You have to understand, Vel said, with the careful precision of someone who had held power for a long time and was aware that he was in unfamiliar territory, that we have absorbed 411 civilizations, that we have never lost this proceeding, that the mathematical reality of your situation has not changed since the first day. He paused. Why are you not afraid? The Secretary General, her name was Dr. Amara Osai, and she was 73 years old, and she had been selected for this role by the United Earth Assembly, specifically because of how long she'd spent studying Dominion law, looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "We are." Silence. "We're afraid," she said. "We've been afraid since the day your ultimatum arrived. Some of us have been afraid for years since we started seeing the patterns that told us you were coming." She held his gaze steadily. "Fear is not the question. The question is what you do with it. And humans," she paused, and the pause had the quality of someone choosing words precisely. "Humans have had a great deal of practice deciding what to do with fear." Vel looked at her. "Our analysts cannot model your behavior," he said. We have run every framework and none of them produce what you actually do." "I know," she said. And then, gently, in the way you tell someone something difficult when you want them to understand rather than just hear it. "That's because your frameworks are built on the assumption that self-preservation is the primary driver of civilizational behavior." She let that sit for a moment. "We do not have a word in any human language for a civilization that surrenders because the odds are bad. We have many words for civilizations that kept going anyway. We have holidays for them. We name our ships after the feeling." Persistent asterisk Ven thought. "We're not trying to defeat you," she said. "We have never been trying to defeat you. We are trying to change what this is. And we are willing to spend a great deal of time and a great deal of lives making it clear that we will keep trying. Because every civilization we have ever found a way forward with, every conflict in our history that ended in something better than destruction, started with someone deciding that the cost of continuing to fight was higher than the cost of figuring out something different." She looked at Vel quietly. "We are trying to make it expensive enough to absorb us that you have to figure out something different. Not because we think we can outlast you militarily, but because we've read 4 centuries of your history and you have never met anyone who was willing to do this, and we think that changes the calculation." Vel was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You prepared for years." "A decade," she said. "You were waiting for us." "We were preparing for you," she said. "There's a difference. We didn't want this, but we knew something like you was out there, something like this moment." She looked at him steadily. "So we prepared, legally, militarily, psychologically. We told our people what was coming so that when the day arrived they would not be paralyzed by it. So that the first response, the 6-minute response, would be the response we had decided on, not the response we were scared into." Vel looked at her for a long moment. "The laughter," he said. "Yes. It was real." "Completely," she said. And then very quietly, "Because we'd done the work. And doing the work knowing you're prepared is its own kind of relief. You sent us something terrifying and we already had the answer. That's funny, Archon. In a particular human way, that's very funny." The proceedings lasted 2 more years. The Dominion legal challenge was partially successful. The absorption was reclassified, after 517 cycles of proceedings, as a cooperative administrative integration, with terms negotiated under Compact Article 7 that preserved Earth's governmental autonomy within a framework of shared Dominion citizenship. The first such arrangement in Dominion history, the first time the word negotiated had applied to the outcome of an ultimatum. The Persistent was never formally decommissioned. It continued to serve in what the human fleet classified as a training role, which meant that every new generation of human officers who might one day face an enemy with overwhelming force superiority spent time aboard a vessel that had taken 2 Dominion cruisers with 41 crew members and treated the experience as a curriculum. Ven filed one more supplementary report, personal rather than official, 3 years after the integration agreement was signed. It was addressed to the High Council archives rather than active distribution, and it contained one paragraph that the archivists eventually flagged as unusually direct for a Dominion military document. The paragraph read, "In 400 years we have encountered species that were stronger than us, faster, more technologically sophisticated, better adapted to survival in hostile environments. We have never encountered a species that was willing to be outmatched. We have never encountered a civilization whose preparation for its own potential annihilation included studying our legal code for a decade, nomming its warships after the feeling of refusing to stop, and responding to an existential ultimatum in 6 minutes with something that the translation matrix kept misreading as a threat until we understood it was something worse. It was not a threat. It was recognition. They recognized the situation immediately, and they recognized it without fear, or rather, with fear subordinated to something for which the Dominion does not have an equivalent concept. The closest our language comes is the word for a soldier who continues fighting after sustaining wounds that should have ended the engagement. We have a word for it, but we use it as a descriptor of physical fact. For humans, it appears to be a philosophy. The final word of Venn's supplementary report was not a military assessment. It was not a strategic recommendation. It was a question, 3 words, unaddressed, submitted to the permanent record of the Dominion Eternal's first and only failed absorption proceeding, where it remained for the next 300 years in the archives, occasionally pulled by researchers who read it and went quiet and didn't quite find a satisfying answer. The 3 words were, "What stops them?" And the archive, across 3 centuries and every civilization the Dominion would encounter after humanity, never received a reply. Because the researchers who pulled it would sit with the question and turn it over and look at the data, the boarding actions, the legal filings, the 6-minute response, the buoys left behind like calling cards in empty space, the laughter, and they would look at humanity's own history, at what humanity had survived before any alien civilization had ever looked in their direction, and they would understand, slowly, and with the particular discomfort of an answer that doesn't provide relief, that the question wasn't rhetorical. It was a warning, not about what humanity had done, about what humanity would do every time to anything that came for them with the assumption that the size of the threat was sufficient reason for the threatened to stop. The galaxy had spent 4 centuries assuming that when a species looked up at the dark and saw something large enough to end them, they would do what every rational civilization does: calculate and adapt and accept and survive. Humanity had looked up at the dark for all of recorded history.